Welcome to the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists. I'm Michael Freedman, the 113th president of the National Press Club. I'm the former general manager of CBS Radio Network, now journalist in residence at University of Maryland Global Campus, and executive producer of the Cow Report public broadcasting series moderated by Marvin Cow. We thank you for joining us today for our virtual headliner event with longtime friend and colleague Dan Rather. Dan Rather has done it all in broadcast journalism and today is an outspoken presence on social media. He's even brought the stories of his storied career to an off-Broadway stage. Dan Rather's career is truly the stuff of legends. Reporting from Dallas for CBS, he broke the news of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. He covered the civil rights movement in the South, served as a war correspondent in Vietnam, was physically removed on live television from the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, challenged President Richard Nixon as a White House correspondent, and in 1981 succeeded Walter Cronkite as anchor of the CBS Evening News, a position he held for the next 24 years. He joins us today from his home in Austin, Texas, to share his thoughts on the press and the presidency, the role of journalism in protecting our democracy, and the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Our event, which is open to all, is being live streamed. We welcome questions from our online audience. To submit a question, please email headliners@press.org. Dan Rather, what a pleasure to have you with us. Welcome.
What a pleasure to be with you, Michael. Thank you very much for having me.
Let's start with the news. Joe Biden has selected as his running mate this fall U.S. Senator Kamala Harris. You tweeted last night, American politics looks more like America tonight. Also, the early Republican attempts to attack and define Kamala Harris look a bit like a game of laser tag in a hall of mirrors. Talk about the significance of this decision and how it might affect this race.
Well, as to the first, it is historic. Obviously, first woman nominated by a major party for vice presidency, the first person of color to be so nominated, that whether the ticket wins or not, and it's I would, as a cautionary note, say it's way too early to say that, wow, this is the winning ticket. I know, and I suspect you know, Michael, many Democrats who are sort of dancing like in the end zone. It's a little early for that. There's a long way to go. But whether this ticket wins or loses, it'll be noted in the future history books many, many years looking ahead. For as long as they write the history of the American presidency, that will be noted for those reasons. Now, as for its effect on the race, let me give a preface, because at my age and stage, you know, I may not be able to do as much reporting as I used to do or would like to do. But sometimes I can make an effort to add some perspective and context, particularly historical perspectives and context. When you look at the modern American presidency, which I would say, let's say from the year 1900 forward, it's hard to make a case that in any presidential election, the vice presidential nominee made the winning difference for the ticket. The only exception in my lifetime that I would argue was the election of 1960, when John Kennedy picked Lyndon Johnson as his vice presidential running mate, believing that he might need Johnson to carry Texas for him, and they won the election, very close election, Johnson carried Texas. But from a historical perspective, the vice presidential candidate, while there's a lot of strum and drang, a lot of coverage of it as a choice is made and as the campaign goes along, it's rarely decisive. Now, will that make a difference this time around? There are certainly supporters in the Biden camp who believe it will. But I come back to what is primarily expected of Senator Harris on the ticket is not make a mistake. Don't embarrass the top of the ticket. That's number one. And number two, carry his or her home state. Well, there's no doubt in my mind that Senator Harris will carry California as a home state. So, you know, that's some perspective on it. I will say that I'm watching carefully, and I will be watching carefully as the campaign goes along. But Senator Harris is, as I think everybody knows at this time, an almost career prosecutor. She is terrific at questioning people, especially cross-examining people. And the vice presidential debate, there's to be one vice presidential debate, will be more anticipated than these vice presidential debates generally are, because there will be a belief, we'll see once the debate gets out, that Senator Harris will she will be more than a match for Vice President Pence. That's just kind of an aside, but it's something to look forward to. That usually the vice presidential debate doesn't get all that much attention. Nobody pays much attention to it. I think that it'll be an exception this year.
Thank you. We're going to come back to politics and coverage of the president and the White House and a lot of other things that are going on now. But I wanted to take you back, Dan, for a moment. 20 years ago, you and I collaborated on a 3-hour program for radio entitled the CBS News 20th Century Roundup. It included what turned out to be the final reunion of all of the surviving members of Edward R. Murrow's original broadcast team from World War II. You may recall that special day when we were joined by anchor Robert Trout and correspondents Richard C. Hotelet, Howard K. Smith, and Larry LeSueur. You also worked during your long tenure at CBS with Eric Sevareid and Charles Collingwood and others who literally invented broadcast journalism with their work as part of Ed Murrow's team during World War II. As we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of the war, could you talk for a few minutes about the influence of the Murrow boys on you and how their work shaped your journalism?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you asked. And I could speak the rest of the afternoon about the Murrow boys and their influence on American journalism in general, and specifically their influence on me. But rest assured, I will not spend the afternoon talking about it. I'll be as brief as I possibly can. But I think it's important to remind current generations that Edward R. Murrow invented electronic journalism as we know it. Before Murrow and the Murrow boys, basically, there was no electronic journalism. Radio was the new revolutionary invention. Radio was the television of its day, the internet of its day, if you will. But radio was still in the early stages when Murrow emerged and the Murrow boys emerged. So that's number one. That everything that has followed in electronic journalism since then has its root with the founder, Edward R. Murrow, and the Murrow boys. That Murrow was tutored in Europe as he toured Europe as an educator. He was not a news person beginning, he was an educator, by William Shirer. Shirer was an experienced newspaper man who spoke fluent German and had come to Germany early specifically saying, this new guy Hitler knew at that time in the 1930s, is going to be real trouble for the world. And he helped convince Edward R. Murrow that Murrow should get out of basically the education radio broadcasting and get into news broadcasting. This is a short way around. And the two of them quickly began putting together a team of radio reporters, real radio reporters. Before Murrow and the Murrow boys, very little radio reporting was done by the people on the radio. They would read newspapers or wire service reports. So as what Churchill called the gathering storm continued to gather with Hitler and Nazism on the move, Murrow and Schreier together, and hiring some early helpers such as Charles Collingwood, Richard C. Hotelet. This is not an all-inclusive list. They put together people who did real reporting. They walked the ground. They were eyewitnesses, and then would get on the radio and describe what they had seen. They also were terrific at supplying context and perspective and analysis to put what they were seeing in some good context. This had not been done before on radio. It was all brand new. And in addition, Murrow, primarily Murrow, and those who worked with him, set what are still today considered to be the gold standard of journalism ethics. That they had a very high standard. And that standard influenced others who followed them in the creation of electronic journalism. By the time we reached the US involvement in World War II with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, others had followed in the Murrow footsteps, if you will. And other networks, particularly what we now call NBC, had formed its own form. But that was the significance of Murrow and the Murrow boys on journalism. I'll get back to the influence on me in a moment very briefly, but the larger important point here is they have influenced American public opinion about the war. You can make a case, and I would make the case, there would be some who argued about it, that Murrow, and primarily Murrow, but those who were working with him, were responsible, not alone, but bore a lot of responsibility for preparing American public opinion for what we had to do in World War II. That Murrow's broadcast from London, for example, when London was under fierce attack by the German Luftwaffe, that those broadcasts, not alone, but primarily those broadcasts, took Americans there. This was the magic of radio. Murrow took Americans there during the bombing runs and began, as I say, to help Franklin Roosevelt prepare American public opinion for any war. As for its influence on me, I had rheumatic fever in the early stages of World War II and was completely bedridden. Rheumatic fever was an incurable disease at the time. It's now easily cured, but at that time I was bedridden. The radio was my constant companion, and I became transfixed by Ed Murrow and the Murrow boys. These men, courageous, brilliant. They were going to faraway places with strange sounding names, living danger and adventure and bringing the war right into my bedroom. And I was transfixed for several years by them. And naturally, as a consequence of them, it left an indelible imprint on me.
As we meet today, Dan, our country's in the midst of at least 3 crises. The coronavirus pandemic, what may well be a generational outcry for racial equality and social justice, and an assault on truth that appears to be led by no less than the President of the United States. We call those who dealt with the Great Depression and those in World War II the greatest generation. How would you say we can apply the lessons learned from these folks and some of what you just talked about in setting the gold standard for journalism, and as we go about our business as a country in dealing with this, how can we put these lessons learned to work to help meet the challenges that we're facing today?
Well, I think number one is, even for those of us who think we know the history very well, to stop, read history, and think. Reflect on what happened in the years of the Great Depression leading into World War II and overlapping World War II. The key to the nation holding itself together, first through the Depression, and then later with the end of the Depression and World War II. The key was our ability to pull ourselves together. The ability was, what got us through was our ability to recognize what unites us. There were plenty of things dividing us. The country was divided along a lot of lines, including racial lines, ethnic lines, religion, but the country was able to pull itself together. Now, one thing that made that not only possible, but eventually made it succeed, was the country was well led. I don't want to get into any partisan political situation here, but historians, both domestic and foreign, have recognized that Franklin Roosevelt and his administrations, they saved the Constitution, they saved their party, they saved capitalism, and as a consequence of that, they saved the country. They did it by pulling people together as much as they could. Roosevelt with his fireside chats on radio, which were heard by almost the entire country, that sort of thing. So one, there was intelligent, strong leadership at the top, but a leadership was dedicated to believing and to operating on the basis that the country couldn't pull itself out of the Depression and certainly couldn't fight a big two-ocean world war unless what was emphasized is what unites us. And then the country as a whole recognized that, particularly once we got into World War II, it's easy to forget, in the early stages of World War II, it looked like we could very well lose. The Japanese and the Germans were on the move everywhere. They were rolling back everything and everybody. And most Americans overwhelmingly realized that everything was on the table. That we had our differences, as I said before, over race and so many other things, but that we had to pull together. So and we did. And that's the big lesson out of that period. Now, bringing it to today, again, there's no desire here to be partisan political in this, but it's a fact that the leadership, the president, believes that what got him in office, got him elected, was his ability to recognize the divisions in the country and to deal with fear and to take advantage of the divisions. So instead of a uniter, he's been a divider. And that has seeped down the rest of the country. And that we are, extremely divided right now. We're as polarized politically as ever. So bringing ourselves to the present time with the pandemic and how embarrassing, how almost humiliating it is for the United States of America, the leader in science for well over a century, the best medical professions in the world, bar none, the wealthiest country in the world, we have been the worst in meeting the challenge of the coronavirus. And to this time, we can't get ourselves united over anything even as simple as wear a mask or not wear a mask. So I think the lessons out of World War II that we can draw is we have to, I would say, draw a deep breath, read, think, and recognize what held us together and got us through the Depression in World War II was our ability to overcome our differences and emphasize the things that unite us.
You touched on one other thing there as well, Dan, and as we recognize this 75th anniversary of VJ Day, Victory Over Japan Day, from the standpoint of human nature, what does it tell you that we're now allies with Japan? Our two countries are quite close. What does it say about forgiveness and the resilience of the human spirit?
Well, again, there's a mighty lesson here that with both the Germans and the Japanese, with some help, but primarily, we, the people of the United States, our fathers and grandfathers, we rebuilt both countries, Germany and Japan. And by the way, not only did we rebuild them, but we contributed mightily to rebuilding almost all of Europe. But there was, again, and the country got, our country, our beloved United States of America got united in a belief after World War II that it was in our interest, but more importantly in the interest of world peace, not to get into punishment, to try to rebuild. And rebuild we did in both Japan and Germany, now to the point, as you point out, that two of our most important allies. I think this speaks miles about the American character at that time, that is in the post-World War II years. Now you will find plenty as we near the end of the second decade of the 21st century, there'll be plenty of people who say, listen, well, Dan, that may have been true at that time, but the basic character of America has changed since then. Many things have changed. We've changed demographically and in so many ways that even if that were the character of America in the early post-World War II, it's no longer the character of America. I disagree with that, but we will be in the process of finding out very soon, because at the moment, we're so divided that it's pretty hard to make out clearly what is the American character. I think our basic character, the character of our fathers and grandfathers and mothers, is still there. But I recognize that the verdict is out as we move deep into the 2020s.
The late Congressman John Lewis said many times, without the press, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings. And at the top of the homepage of the National Press Club's website, we say journalists are witnesses. To silence the press is to silence the people, silence accountability, silence truth. Talk to our journalists that are tuning in today to this conversation, Dan, about the role of the press in helping Americans and the world make good decisions as we go forward in this unprecedented year.
Well, thank you for asking me, but I do want to say as a short preface, I'll try to answer the question, but I want to say as a short preface that I'm not sure that I should be in a position of trying to give advice and counsel to anyone. Let's face it, I've made my mistakes. You can't be in journalism as long as I have been and not made them. So I'm going to answer the question, but with some trepidation and some questions whether I'm the best person to answer the question or not. But no, it begins, and particularly with any journalist, but I think particularly with young journalists and those who are just getting started or haven't been in the craft very long. It's always a good idea to ask yourself from time to time and remind yourself, why am I doing this? Why did I get into journalism? And right behind that to say, well, and what is it I'm trying to do? But I think overwhelmingly with most journalists, the answer of why they get into journalism. No doubt there are a lot of reasons, but paramount with most journalists, I believe it certainly was the case with me, is that you want to make a contribution. You want to be doing something that's bigger than yourself. You want to be part of something that's bigger than yourself. You want your life to count for something. That's why most people get into journalism. There are other factors, including sometimes ego or narcissistic things, but that's one of them. So then the second question, well, what is it that we're trying to do in this trying to make a contribution? Well, basically what journalists are trying to do or should be trying to do is get to the truth, or as close to the truth as is humanly possible, and tell it. That's our basic job. Now, with all of the pressures, including the personal pressures to make a living, to meet the house notes and the car payments, and the exterior pressures of people in powerful positions trying to intimidate the press, it's sometimes easy to forget, number one, why we got into the profession, and number two, what it is we think it is we're trying to do. Others will have to make a decision on how well or how poorly we do what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to do. I think if more often we can remind ourselves of that, the better we're going to be, and the better we're going to be able to make a contribution in what is clearly now a very dangerous time for the country.
There have been comparisons made of this year to 1968. You were in the center of virtually every major news story that year, from the war in Vietnam to the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy, the decision by President Lyndon Johnson not to run for re-election, the protests across the country to end both racial inequality and the war. Do you make a comparison, or could you make a comparison between that turbulent year and 2020?
Yes, I think there's a comparison to be made, but there's a danger in that. There's some danger of overemphasizing the similarities. I would say 1968 was probably as close to a year like 2020 has been as any we've had. Having said that, it's a different century, a different time. We are a different country, so one doesn't want to draw too many close parallels. But among the parallels that I think can legitimately be drawn is, number one, on race. That much of the violence, much of the protesting in 1968 was based on race. Now, opposition to the war had manifested itself in a lot of protests during the 60s, and there were some still certainly around in 68. But the riots of 1968, and let's remember that there were riots in many major American cities, and that the army, the regular army, had to be called out in some places, Detroit, for example, to quell those riots. But the riots were the ones that were race-based were primarily, they were people of color taking part in those riots. The anti-war riots were heavy with younger people and Caucasian people. Now, my reason for raising that is here in 2020, these most recent manifestations in the streets that we've had, these mass protests, have been different from those in 1968 for their diversity. What struck me the most difference, that these crowds of people protesting in the streets against racial prejudice, crying for justice, were extremely diverse, religiously, ethnically, religiously, and in terms of gender. We didn't see that in the protests, particularly the race protests of 1968. And, that is a major difference. We'll say one other similarity which holds up 1968, that you had a growing disenchantment with the nation's leadership, that people of both parties were, not only mumbling, but saying aloud, listen, our leadership has really let us down and we need to make a major change. And of course, a major change was made in the presidential election of 1968 when Richard Nixon was elected. We have yet to see whether in 2020 that the calls and demand for change are met.
You talked about diversity and the big difference being in the protests here, particularly for racial equality, social justice, the diversity today. Do you also get a sense of a sustainability of these protests this year? We've seen over the course of the last several years the really tragic killings of a number of African American young men in different cities, and there were protests, and then the other news superseded the news of those protests. This year, and in the midst of a pandemic when people are being asked to stay home, these protests have not dissipated. They're continuing, and any protest that started out as including some violence, the protest then turned peaceful, and that diversity was there. Do your instincts tell you that what we're seeing this year may be something different?
Yes, my instincts are sort of whispering that to me, that this year that there may be follow-up, given the nature of these demonstrations. One, given the persistence of them, they've not faded away quickly, and given what we pointed out before, how diverse they are. That's what my instincts tell me. But as you know, and you teach your students all the time, Michael, as a reporter, you follow your instincts, but you don't report your instincts. You'll have to see. My instincts sometimes are right, sometimes are wrong. It's such a complicated and dangerous situation in the country now, with this toxic bouillabaisse of dangers to the country, the pandemic, the economic collapse, how else can you say it, combined with a White House that shows all the signs of being dysfunctional, that all of this together makes it very difficult to know whether what we've seen in the streets, which is obviously a reflection of what many people in the country feel, that we need to take some specific and important steps in the direction of doing what we can to reduce racial discrimination. But while my instincts tell me that this time may be different than what we've seen in recent years, and that something concrete may come out of it, it's still hanging out there in the balance. And this election in November will have a lot to say. It may have the decisive say in whether what we've seen in the streets, what we've heard from large sectors of the population about making immediate and rather radical change in so many things, actually results in anything being done or not. Right now, while my instincts tell me that yes, it's going to get done, at least some of it's going to get done, one can't be assured of it.
Let me turn to some questions that we're getting in from our National Press Club members who are viewing the program. Question from Bill Earl. How has the role of the nightly news anchor changed since you last sat in that seat?
Well, there's been, monumental change. But having said that, what hasn't changed? My time in the anchor chair, of which it was a great honor for me at CBS, stretched roughly from 1981 to 2004, 24 years. And during that 24 years, the role of the anchor, both within journalism and within the society as a whole, had changed considerably. And since I left the anchor chair, it's changed even more. During the 1980s, when the so-called big three of the over-the-airwaves networks were still dominant, absolutely dominant. Cable was brand new. When ABC, NBC, and CBS ruled the television network news world, the audiences were large and loyal. As cable television began to develop, and then after cable television, the internet, the evening news of any one of the three networks ceased to be what it had been for much of the time I was in the anchor chair, and Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings were also there. At that time, what we're talking about as late as certainly the 1980s and in the early 1990s, the evening news was sort of metaphorically a national hearth around, in the evening, a large percentage of the American public, Republican, Democrat, in between, regardless of race or regional residents, tuned into the evening news to get a sort of consensus view of what the most important news of the day was. That's the reason I say the national hearth, if you will, gather, metaphorically gather around the fire. By the time we get into the mid-1990s, this was already beginning to change. As cable news, which was 24-hour around the clock, instead of having a deadline once a day at 6:30 or 7 o'clock at night, in terms of a news organization for your main news product to be put on the air, and from a consumer standpoint, the one time a day you wanted to tune in, had changed completely. Because instead of a deadline every day, you had a deadline every minute with around the clock television. And this forced any number of changes, not all of them good. So that's when, and then once the internet came in, it wasn't just a deadline every minute or two, it was a deadline every nanosecond. It's a combined pressure of constant cable news and the internet news has reduced the importance of the evening news broadcast tremendously. I give a lot of credit to the three networks for, number one, keeping the evening news in the position they're in. And I have a lot of respect for all three of the major anchors that are now anchoring. They're doing their best, and they still perform a very important function. But it's a far cry from the sort of national hearth that we had during the 80s and early 90s.
You're still very much operating in the present. You've become quite a presence on social media. Talk a little bit about the value of social media, how you found it, and perhaps some of the challenges and the dangers of social media.
Well, first of all, I came to social media late, and I didn't find it, it found me. I have a news organization, a small news organization called News and Guts. We operate a news site called newsandguts.com. I work with people who are much younger than I am. Let's face it, Michael, these days everybody's younger than I am. But I work with young people, and they convince me, Dan, if you want to be relevant, even in a small microscopic way, it's not an option. You have to be on social media. So I agreed to try it. When I tried it, I was amazed that, yes, in some phrases, we found an audience. And I'm still finding my way with social media. I'm active on Twitter, I'm active on Facebook, and as I say, we have our news site, newsandguts.com. I'm feeling my way as we go. It reminds me of the early days of television. You know, I came out of print journalism into radio and then into television. I came into television roughly in the early 60s. At that time in television news, everybody was making it up as we went along. We were learning, we just made it as we go. It reminds me now of social media here in 2020. All of us are struggling with, well, what is it we're trying to do? And making our mistakes as we go. But among the questions, you know, for myself is, well, you know, I spent the bulk of my career, nearly all of my career, trying to be a straight news reporter. My job was to report the news, find the news, tell it as straight as I can, mix it with some analysis, and let other people handle the commentary and editorializing. But now here, in, you know, I'm on the backside of the mountain. I don't know what is my role now. Well, what I'm trying to do is carve out a role on social media in which I say, folks, look, I've been a few places, done a few things, been lucky to live a long time. And I'd like to try to put what's happening now in some context and perspective, back to those two words, and use hopefully historical perspective. Now, in order to do that, I may use different language than I've used before. And you are to see me, I am now, you know, I do a lot of commentating, but that's different than editorializing. Editorializing urges a course of action. I would argue that commentating doesn't. But at any rate, that's what I'm trying to do on social media. There are days when I think, well, we're succeeding a little bit, but on other days, you know, who knows?
We have a couple questions from National Press Club member and our member of our Board of Governors, Danny Al-Farouk. It seems very hard to report on the president, especially since he makes so many false statements and continues to make them even after he's been corrected. How would you interview President Trump?
Well, by the way, I'm available to do that. I don't expect it to happen, but I'm available. Well, I think we have seen in several recent interviews that the key to any interview is preparation, and then listen and to pick up on what the interview subject says. I think particularly with President Trump and powerful people such as President Trump, that it's important to not only follow up, but continue to follow up. And also, when he tells a lie, which is somewhat different than just an untruth. A lie is when it's untrue and he knows it's untrue. And he does a lot of that. But, you know, one, follow up, deep follow up. We've seen some of this in some of the recent interviews on television, I'm happy to say. And to pick up on what he says, and when what he says is obviously untrue, call his and the audience's attention to it. But don't just move on to the next question. Stay on it. And I can't emphasize enough the follow up. And the best interviews with President Trump, including several fairly recently, have been those in which the interview subject picks up on things that he says and calls his hand, in effect calls it a lie and says, what are you going to say about that? And to dig deep into it. You know, I have no illusions. I like to think I'm a pretty good interviewer, but there are some excellent interviewers practicing today. And when they get a chance, some of them are doing a very good job. The more difficult time is for the regular White House beat correspondents. You know, first there's the struggle to get called upon, and then do you get more than one question? The president is very much in charge in the White House briefing, so that the journalists are at a disadvantage. Whereas with a one-on-one interview, the journalist has a much better chance of holding his own.
How would you compare your on-air back and forth with President Richard Nixon during the time of your service as White House correspondent to some of the back and forth that we're seeing today between the president and the White House press corps?
Well, there is some similarity in that President Nixon, at the time in 1974, the the most famous or best known interchange between myself and the president. That President Nixon was of a habit of, if he thought you were going to ask a tough question, remember this is a news conference. It's not a news in the briefing room, and it's not a one-on-one conversation. It's a news conference with a crowd of people. And the president would want, his goal was to try to throw you a little off balance before you answer your question, give some smart remark or something to knock you off balance. And that's the reason he said to me, "Are you running for something?" And I just wanted to get on my question. So without even thinking, I just thought back, "Well, no, Mr. President, are you?" But the difference is that was a one-time only situation in that time and place. It had rarely have ever been done before, certainly not in that form. Today, with the televised briefings and the president appearing in the briefing room himself some of the time, it's much more common to have that sort of back and forth happen.
Another question from Danny Al-Farouk. There's a strong distrust of the news media in a segment of the American population, and even support for conspiracy theories on a scale that perhaps we haven't seen before. Is there anything that journalists can actually do about that to engender more trust in the work they're doing?
That's a very good question, and one I spend some time thinking about myself. I'm glad somebody asked the question. First of all, I think it may be that this period, for what is described there, is unprecedented. We've had some of it before, but not so unrelentingly so as is now the case. So I would take the perhaps out and say that this is unprecedented time for that. As to what journalists can do, I'm afraid I don't have anything profound, or for that matter, even wise, except that for journalists in these kinds of situations, I think it's always helpful to say, just do our job, just do the damn job. And the job is to keep coming back to what I said before, try to find out the truth, or as close to the truth as humanly possible, and tell it. And don't get intimidated in any way. Don't back up, don't back down, don't turn around. Just keep coming, keep trying to do quality journalism, and hope that in the end that there'll be enough public appreciation for it to continue to support what you're doing.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from member Claude Porcella. Before the pandemic, you performed in a theater in front of a live audience telling your life story. Did you find the transition from broadcast journalist to, in a way, actor difficult?
Short answer is yes. This was done for the company Audible, which came to me and said, "We'd like you to tell us the early story of your life and career, and how did you get to where you were?" So the early years. I did not realize that it was going to begin with a regular theater appearance off Broadway. And while I had done my fair share of platform speaking from time to time over the years, I'd never had this theater experience. And I'm not going to overstate it, but I didn't have stage fright, but something maybe close to it, saying to myself, how the hell did I get myself in this situation, standing in the wings, about to walk out on stage alone in front of a live theater audience. But you know what? It didn't turn out badly. In fact, I think it turned out pretty well. And in the end, I enjoyed it.
That's terrific. And a related question from another board member, Mark Sheff. What TV anchoring skills translated well to appearing on stage, and what new skills do you feel you developed in going through this exercise?
Well, the one skill that anchoring stood me in good stead for the theater is obviously in an anchor situation, you're alone. You have a vast news organization, in the case of CBS, around you. You have all kinds of people in the studio. But in the end, you have to walk up to that desk and the microphone and look the camera and the audience in the eye. And there is that sense, it's on you. You got to either stand and deliver or not. And so that's an anchor skill, to do that night after night after night, to get yourself up to the level where you're dedicated to doing your best performance, if you want to call it that, but at the same time to keep yourself, your inner self, be kind of quiet at the center. So that translated and helped me in the theater. What I learned in the theater is that if you trust the audience, it'll pay dividends. Now, in a way, this was relearning something out of television, but with a live audience, it's different. You appear before the live audience, and I don't care who you are, there's that fear: am I going to get through to them? And as you begin to realize that you get through the audience, they laugh when you hope they'd laugh. They may even applaud when you hope they applaud. Then you have this sense, well, now they trust me, I can trust them. I didn't have that before I appeared on stage. And at the end of the second night, this was a 2-night run, I had that. I could walk out saying to myself, you can trust the audience. If you give them your best stuff, they'll give you back their attention.
Do you think that's true on television as well?
I do. I think there's way too much emphasis on television on what are considered the basic anchor skills. Do you gesture at the right time? Do you smile with your eyes? Do you smile at the right time? These are kind of mechanical things. I don't say they aren't important, but the single most important thing for an anchor is for the audience to trust the anchor. And that's something it's hard to define. It's hard to describe how you do it. Frankly, my own way was to try to say to the audience, for the length and breadth of my so-called anchor career, was to say, folks, no, I'm not the best pure anchor person that television has produced. I don't claim to be. What I am is I'm a reporter. I'm a lifetime reporter with a passion for reporting. And, I present myself as someone who covers the news, as the person who's bringing the news. And I hope that you'll give that some credibility. That was my strong bet. And I would argue that it paid off, that you wouldn't be the major so-called face of the network major anchor for 24 years, unless the audience, a large segment of the audience came to trust you, whatever your so-called anchor skills were or were not.
That's a really important point, particularly for young people who might say today, I'd like to be an anchor on television. I think back to the fact that Walter Cronkite was a very fine wire service correspondent for the United Press throughout World War II, and made quite a name for himself with his journalism then, before ever joining CBS. And we talked about at the beginning of this program your career as a correspondent, as a war correspondent, as a White House correspondent. And so you're saying it's more about being a complete reporter, a complete journalist, than just wanting to be someone who sits behind a desk and reads the news.
I believe that very strongly. I recognize that there are people who've done very well, made a lot of money by being what I call the hothouse plant, which is to say all they've ever done is anchor from the studio. But to let a young person wanting to come up, I would say, even in television and even in anchoring, learn to write. Good writing is the bedrock of the craft. And to make of yourself a good writer will make of yourself at least a reasonably good analytical thinker. And those things, over the long haul, I think give you the best chance to make a lifetime living as a television reporter, whether it's anchor or otherwise.
And of course, you bring it down to writing, and one of the best writer-editors was housed right at CBS. He was Ed Murrow's editor, and then Walter Cronkite's editor, and then he founded the broadcast journalism program at American University, and that was Ed Bliss, who was absolutely terrific. When we look at the history of, in particular, CBS News, and those who've studied it see Douglas Edwards, Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather, and just among the three of you, we're talking more than 50 years of three people. Do you see the option for that kind of stability anymore in this business?
I think there is. I think it's more limited than it was when Douglas Edwards was coming up, or Walter Cronkite, or for that matter, myself. But yes, I think there's always a chance to do it. A lot depends on who owns the platform, that is, who owns the network, who owns the station. Because Michael, having been at CBS, I know that you know, the greatest thing about working at CBS News, and there were so many great things, you know, I'm, I'm always grateful that I had the time at CBS and I had a great run there. I have no complaints, up and down mistakes I've made, but I had no complaints with it. Because here's what was created at CBS News in its heyday. I think there's still vestiges of this, and you know this. At the CBS News I knew, the CBS News of Edward R. Murrow and on through Douglas Edwards and Walter. CBS News is the corporation as well as the news division created the belief that CBS News was a kind of magical, mystical kingdom where every correspondent was expected to be a kind of knight of news, high integrity, brave, resilient, brilliant, all of those things. And that everybody in the news division, from the person who cleaned up in the cafeteria up, was dedicated to that proposition that this is this magical, mystical kingdom of news. Now, it wasn't true, but the fact that we believed it was true made us better. It's hard to find that these days. I can't say you can't find it, but it's hard to find. But what we had then, and again I'm saying I'm not at CBS News now, I don't know what happened now, was a precious thing, not only for those of us who worked there, but for the so-called consumers of news, for the public at large, because it was a news division dedicated to the highest standards. We didn't always meet them, but we were always trying.
You mentioned also about the commitment, and the corporate commitment is really important. And forgive me if I get this story a little wrong, but I've heard it over the course of time that there was a point in time when William Paley, the chairman of CBS, got together with his correspondents around the world and asked them what their plans were for the next year, and each correspondent talked about some pretty grand plans for the following year. And the way I heard the story, Winston Burdett said to the chairman, "Mr. Paley, this is all well and good, but this is going to cost a ton of money." And Bill Paley looked at him and said, "You guys just do what you need to do. I've got Jack Benny to make me money." And I wonder if that corporate commitment to news is still there. Do you have a sense that there are organizations that are totally committed to that?
There are a few, but there are fewer today than there used to be. And this is a very important point. We could spend a whole other program talking about this. But Bill Paley was interested in making money, and he made a lot of money at the time. But he viewed news as a public service. And so did his peers at the time who owned NBC and ABC. Said, look, if news makes money, that's fine, I'm glad of that, but that's not why I have news. We view news as a public service. In the large corporations that now control more than 80% of the genuine national news coverage, I don't know of a single one where that attitude prevails at the very top of the corporation. It may be, but I don't see it. And what we used to call at CBS News the mahogany suites, where the furniture is mahogany and the corporate leadership. The idea that news should be viewed strictly as a public service has pretty much disappeared. And the way you tell that is, let's take prime time. Prime time on any one of the three, let's call traditional networks. If you walked into one of the mahogany suites and said, we need to do a 1 hour program every night for 5 nights straight at 10 o'clock at night, prime time on Afghanistan, one of two things would happen. I think you would either be seen as losing your mind or smoking something very expensive, which is a smart aleck way of saying I don't think you get very far with it. You don't see that happen. And that indicates, and also the amount of money that news divisions spend on, say, foreign coverage. At the very time we need more, better international news, what used to be called foreign news, we have the least and the least quality that we've had in a very long time. And that's because the corporate leadership won't pay to have that kind of coverage. But, you know, I don't want to sound like yesterday's man. I recognize the business has changed a great deal. The practice of journalism has changed a great deal. But you've given me an opportunity, and I will say so, that I wish that somebody could get with the leaders of the major corporations that control most of the news dissemination in the country today and say, could you think of it as public service rather than money making? Maybe for a year, maybe for 2 years, but commit yourself to seeing news as public service would be a great service to the country. I don't expect that's going to happen, but hope springs eternal.
We have one more question. I've been a huge fan of yours for years and could listen to you all day. I see the upcoming presidential election as the most important one in my lifetime. As a gay man, I'm concerned not just for who wins the election, but the outcomes from it, i.e. Supreme Court, etc. Being a member of a community that has been marginalized, what actions can I make to help ensure we right the wrongs of 2016, and what can I do to help galvanize my community and other diverse communities to get out and campaign, take action, vote, and overall realize the importance of the November 3rd election? I know that's a loaded question, so I appreciate any insight you have.
Well, first of all, you're already on the right track, and you'll find a way. Just don't let your passion diminish. You know, it's very easy, and I've been guilty of it myself, to talk a good game about organizing, going door to door if necessary, joining a group that can make a difference, giving it the time and the effort, and being persistent should be your guidepost. But since you feel that strongly about it, I would say it's your obligation to yourself, to say nothing, your obligation to the country, to make a contact today if you can, if not today, certainly tomorrow, with whatever political organization is near you or that you prefer, and get involved and stay involved. Time after time, I find people will talk a good game in August, but by the time November or late October or November comes around, that the passion is faded and sometimes they don't even get to the polls. But I do compliment you for thinking those terms, because I don't make predictions about elections, but I will say this, that it's way too early for anyone to say to themselves, well, Donald Trump is finished. There are a number of paths in which Donald Trump can win re-election, and it would be a mistake for anyone to assume otherwise. And if you're of the opinion that you want to change the presidency, the only way to do it is to get people to the polls in November. And if you feel as passionately about it as you do, then the time to get busy was yesterday.
Another member, fine young journalist Menachem Wecker, asks, generally speaking, are you optimistic for the future?
Yes, I am optimistic for the future. I'm an optimist by nature and by experience. And I do think that we as a people, as a society, as a country, will get through this deep and in many ways dark valley. It may take a while, but I think we'll get through it. But only if we act. I'm not one of those people who says, oh, well, things are going to be all right, just give it time, things will work out. I'm optimistic if we call on what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, and the traditional American character of let's work together, let's unify around those things which we feel natural unity, and accentuate our unity, not our divisions. Then under those circumstances, I'm optimistic, and in most days, very optimistic.
Dan, as we close with the last question, as a journalist and a person who has time and again demonstrated the courage of your convictions and who has made a difference in his profession and the world, last bit of guidance for those who want to pursue careers in the field and for all of our journalists on the front lines today?
Courage. Worth reminding ourselves what the ancient philosophers were in unison about, that of all the virtues, courage is the most important, because courage makes the other virtues possible. And it's easy in life in general, and I would say particularly in journalism, it's easy to get discouraged. So, in a word, courage. As a practical matter, I mentioned it before, anybody just starting in journalism, or for that matter, people who've been in it a while, remember that writing and dedicating yourself to ever improving your writing is the absolute bedrock of the craft.
Thank you, Dan. And that will be our last word. Our thanks to Dan Rather, whose News and Guts organization speaks to multiple generations of journalists and the general public about what matters to Dan and to many of us. Dan, we will be sending you one of our National Press Club coffee mugs, so you may have a complete set of those by now, along with the hope that you will join us again in person in the very near future here in Washington. Great good luck, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good luck, Godspeed.
Our thanks to our producer, Lindsay Underwood, and our terrific National Press Club team behind the scenes here in the Broadcast Operations Center. Also, Alex Van Amsen in your office, Dan, for all of her efforts. And we thank our National Press Club members and guests for your good questions and for joining us. This is Mike Freedman. Be well, stay safe, and have a good day.